as a historian of the Black resistance tradition in continental as well as diasporic Africa, I am personally offended by the way that Blackness is being weaponized in this electoral cycle in order to justify white supremacist genocide in Gaza.
Oh, for fuck's sake, bro.
now,
I hate it with this academic veneer. It's so fucking stupid. Yeah, sorry, most Black Americans are not aligned with whatever the fuck you're supporting. Like, okay, whatever. We might have a conversation. Okay, let's see. Hello, old friend.
Oh my God, it's LonerBox.
Hell no. How you doing?
I'm all right.
So
Fake revealed.
I wanted to see who might be voting for Jill Stein. I don't know where the appeal is. Yeah, I'm just curious. You said you're you're in a blue state potentially voting for Jill Stein.
No, I'm a potential Jill Stein voter because look, I'm convinced that people in blue states should engage in vote trading. Okay, call up a green friend in a purple state and tell them, hey, I'll vote green if you vote blue. This is something the Supreme Court actually found this legal back in 2001. There was a whole plan to do it, to like get green voters in swing states to vote blue and blues to vote green. It got in a bunch of legal kerfuffles, but I'm actually pissed that this isn't something that Dems or other groups are doing. Anyway, I will vote green if any green person in your audience wants to vote blue. So yeah, I'm a Jill Stein voter. That's right, Loner.
As a way to get the Democrats in, though, right? Like is that less of an endorsement of her policies, or
okay, clearly I'm a Jill Stein voter. Okay, I don't know why we're putting all this.
Yeah. Okay. So, insofar as her policies over the Democrats, like her approaches to foreign policy and all the rest of it. So this is where I am.
That really matters, right? Like she's obviously a protest vote. The only reason you do it is you want to signal that the Dems go left.
The other reason you do it is that you're like an unwitting Russian stooge who wants to make it easier for Trump to win.
Yeah, but that won't happen if you only do it in blue states. So I don't know. That like the logic seems that it probably makes sense in hard red states and pretty much all blue states, like over 5 points blue. If you're voting Stein, doesn't really matter.
Isn't a lot of her support, isn't her kind of like focus areas coming from swing states though, like Michigan?
She is trying to focus on Michigan because that's where a lot of Arab and Muslim voters are, and they're really pissed with the Democratic Party. Which, fair enough. There is like 200,000 injured, like what was like 1 in 10 people in Palestine messed up. So understandable that they might be pissed about the world's largest political party supporting that. Yeah.
Do you think the race would be better if she was gone?
I mean, it would be slightly better. Yeah. The margin is really much smaller than people think, though. So like in 2016, people will always point to 2016. The problem is that a majority of Stein voters wouldn't have voted Clinton. This comes from the cooperative, I forget the name for it, the CCES data set. I think it's like 56% of people who voted Stein just wouldn't have voted if she wasn't on the ballot. And then another like 8% would have voted Trump if she wasn't on the ballot. So the net margin for Clinton was about 25% of Stein voters. So it only would have flipped, I think, Michigan, but it wouldn't have changed at all in like Pennsylvania or the other.
Well, this is assuming Jill Stein doesn't also do like an RFK and drop out near the end after she's kind of done her work to pressure the party and then say we should still vote Democrats to push them from within.
That's actually the thing that I was pissed about. Did you see that there was a plan to do precisely that she turned down?
Really?
Yeah, no, I can go pull it up.
Yeah. You're not helping me with my Kremlin theories here, my friend.
I mean, I don't think that she's a Russian stooge. I just think that a lot of people in that part of the left were like way too credible towards Russia because they're way too credible towards like Assad. There's like a lot of soft campism. In the same way that I would say that a lot of people in like, not to denigrate too much, but like your part of the left, perhaps my part of the left, are too soft towards the United States because we have a little bit of first campism. I would say for her, it's way too, like, she's way not soft campus. Like, she was willing to eat with Putin, right?
Whilst also saying that she was there to promote peace and saying that we're there to stop American exceptionalism, like a year after Russia annexed Crimea. Yeah, it's kind of bizarre.
Yeah, I think I don't know what goes on in her head. I'm not willing to defend it. Like, let me put it like this: I don't actually even care if she is a Russian stooge or whatever. The point is just to signal. Like, it's sort of, when you're voting for the Democratic Party, you're not endorsing everything they believe. Like, it's just,
yep.
I don't, if you ask a Trump voter, when you vote for Trump, do you endorse everything he does? They'll tell you, of course not. Like, any evangelical will tell you that it's moronic to think that they endorse him, like getting divorced and having 3 wives or whatever. The same is just true for every politician. I think voting is a tool. It's not an endorsement, it's how you can absolve yourself of voting for a bad party. And it's how you can absolve yourself for voting for a slightly better and possibly Russia infiltrated party. I don't know.
I guess this is just a question about whether or not she's doing like anything in terms of her contribution that is helpful to any kind of discourse or rhetoric. Like I think her approach
Me?
to
I don't.
Palestine in particular is incoherent and predatory. I don't think it's actually. I think it is just preying on like the emotional vulnerabilities and the kind of like ideological capture of the Muslim community and probably a lot of white leftists as well. And I don't think it's gonna like. I think what she's advocating for wouldn't help. I don't think. I think all it does is helps the likes of Trump or incidentally maybe even Netanyahu by that extension.
So I linked you. I think you're right that there is a lot of cynical exploitation. I linked you. This is Jason Call, who I believe is the campaign manager now for Jill Stein. He's also a Green candidate, and he's outlining why they didn't go with that proposal you were suggesting a minute ago of like conditionally pressure the Democrats to do a ceasefire, and if they do a ceasefire, drop out. And so that was literally what was proposed to the Greens. There was a woman named Nora Erakat, who is I believe she's Palestinian. She's like pro-Palestine. And she was like, hey, I will join your ticket as VP on the condition that you will drop out if, and their demand was both a ceasefire and an arms embargo, which just wasn't going to happen. But if that both happened, then they would drop out. And so that kind of conditional pressure makes a lot of sense to me. And no, I like the Green Party is completely unserious for not considering that kind of action.
Well, it's also that, because it felt like for the first half of the year, the big call was ceasefire. Like that was the purity test. That was like you had to support a ceasefire, which I understand. And then, but suddenly Kamala is talking about ceasefire. We know that she's less friendly to Netanyahu than Biden is. We know that Biden has taken measures that we haven't seen from a Democrat or an American president since like the early 90s in terms of sanctions and the settlements and withholding of like some aid. So, but then suddenly she started doing that, and then people moved over to arms embargo, which is a completely outlandish like proposal. So yeah, fuck.
I would say two things there. One is that an arms embargo, I think what people actually mean is stop sending bombs. Like I literally think it's like it's like a semantic mismatch. There's some people who actually want an arms embargo, like a proper embargo. But I think most people are like, when they say it, what they actually mean is please stop sending military aid to Israel.
Like like when you say bombs, you mean like strictly offensive arms, or?
I mean, probably. I would bet you that's probably 90% of people who say it might be fine with that, but I don't have numbers.
I don't know if that's but that's almost definitely not true because Germany withheld offensive arms, and people think they're like the biggest backers of the genocide because they still give defensive and like helmets and shit like that to Israel, even though they're also one of the biggest funders of Palestinian aid. Yeah. I don't know. The way that vice president pick of hers is talking, these people just want Israel destroyed. Like,
I can't speak to that precisely. Like, we don't have super precise polls on like the subset of a subset of people. But I guess what I will say is that, you're right that in some areas Biden has stepped up pressure on Israel. At the same time, we're watching something that is like just a deeply brutal event, right? Like this is a really high rate of death, a really high rate of injury. It's an extremely high speed. There's going to be a lot of secondary effects. Like, what is it? Children are supposed to be going back to school. They're not. There's just this massive loss of human capital and of human life. And so saying like, oh, he increased sanctions on the settlers, that's great. He could have done it 4 years ago, and he's only doing that now, possibly as a way to try and get people off his back rather than, just stop sending bombs, which is not that hard. And, you can argue that maybe he's not doing it for electoral reasons. Sure. But just I don't think it's morally defensible. I think you could argue it's electorally defensible, maybe, but I don't even know that that's true. It seems like most Democratic voters are overwhelmingly on board with like a ceasefire now, and a pretty strong one, like with stopping military aid to Israel. I think it's something 80% of Democratic voters oppose Israel's invasion of Gaza, even. Like they're like fundamentally opposed to it. So I don't know. I don't think it's defensible while there's this amount of death and destruction going on to be like, well, he did increase pressure in this one other area by 5%. That's good. He should have done it 4 years ago and should have been doing that like here.
So which kind of ceasefire do you think they should be pushing for? Like a full like the Hamas terms, like they just withdraw and allow all the aid trucks in and let Hamas just rebuild and hope they don't try again, or what?
I mean, I'm not sure, right? Like I know that's sort of a cop-out, but I don't know what the right model is. I do know that you probably need to stop the killing while Israel is conducting killing on this level of like disregard for civilian life. Like that's just unacceptable. I don't
have their operations. Their operations are a lot slower than they were at the beginning of the war. We understand that, right? Like I think right now their whole focus, they keep talking about like, well, they've been using like smaller munitions in general. The death rate is not going up as high as it used to. We know that like basically their military advantages from their strikes are not nearly as high as they were at the beginning. So they have to ultimately like go slower. So
the question is that because Israel's adopted a more humane approach and this is sort of something we won't know till after, but is it because they've adopted a more humane approach, or because they've run out of the easy targets, and because the U.S. has provided some pressure on them not to drop JDAMs on refugee camps? Like,
no,
like
I
just,
think
when you look at like the Jabila camp attack, what was it, like 100 killed? Like the military gain from that kind of attack versus the civilian death is just a ridiculously high civilian casualty ratio.
Well, there's a few caveats, right? We don't know how many of those 100 people were civilians because no one tells us, and we also know that there was infrastructure as well as because Jabalia, like the problem with the refugee camps is that they're not just refugee camps, they're also military bases, right? Like unfortunately that's what Hamas does, and that's where they get their most radicalized people to. It's where it's easier for them to recruit people and all that kind of shit. So maybe those strikes in Jabalia were criminal. Like I don't know. They seem to be based on reports now, but again, we don't know because I don't know how we can judge the disregard for civilian life if we don't actually know what proportion of people dying are civilians. That's like a really basic piece of information that we haven't got from this war.
Well, sure, but that would be frustrating not to get from like either side, right? Like, yes, it's bad that maybe Hamas is not reporting it, but it's also bad that Israel apparently has such poor intelligence that they can't.
Well, they do. Israel gives you numbers. People just that no one believes it, right?
Okay.
Israel said that they've killed like about maybe just a bit under half or maybe like a third of the people they've killed are militants. I think the United States and Iraq in Mosul was 2.5 civilians per militant. So they're putting themselves roughly along there, maybe a bit worse. But no one believes that.
I mean, I just find, okay, it's when someone says, say, Hamas has a high level of respect for civilian life, and then you see them, launching unguided rockets towards, just civilian areas without pretty much any regard in the world. You're like, oh no, well, they don't have a very high regard for civilian life. When you look at Israel, shutting off water, shutting off food, preventing aid, basically destroying the infrastructure, just moving masses and masses of people, like the idea that this is a state that has a high level of regard for civilian life, I think that you agree, is almost certainly not true.
So you said three things there in quick succession: shutting off war, shutting off food, shutting off aid. So you're talking about the quote from the Total Siege quote, right? When they turned off the pipes right at the beginning.
Yep.
So there's a very brief period right at the beginning of the war when there were about 20 odd breaches in the fence when they weren't letting anyone in and out of the strip before they secured the border. As far as I know, after that, 2 of those 3 water pipes were turned back on right away, apart from the one in the north, which was the evacuated zone, or supposed to be the evacuated zone. As for shutting off aid, I don't know if they've shut off aid. I feel like the amount of aid trucks, it went down for the first 2 months of the war, but then after that, it went back up again. So I don't know what you mean by shutting off aid and shutting off food.
Not to pre-war levels, and
above pre-war levels for food.
That's not my understanding. I don't know. When I looked at it last, that did not seem to be true. What I would note is that even so, you mentioned, they turned off water supply to the north, and they said that was an evacuated zone. Well, I like if you look at the opinions of many people in the UN, that's an argument that too is a war crime. That like mass movement of civilians with basically no prior information aside from like a very short period that, hey, you're gonna have to get out of here, and with virtually no attempt to make that transition possible, like transition assistance or like providing aid at the destination or anything along those lines. Like that is, again, like that's close, that either is or is close to a war crime.
But I don't know if they you're saying that they so I don't know the rules about whether or not you're supposed to evacuate people and for how long. I thought you were supposed to evacuate if there's a war happening, but when you're talking about the
doing so without providing aid to the civilians is a war crime. Yeah,
like, well, it's not providing. Your job is not to provide aid legally. Your job is to allow aid to get in, which it seems to be that after those breaches in the fence were dealt with, the number of aid trucks started going up. That was my understanding. We can look at the stats if you want from the that's recorded by the UN. I mean,
if we're going to go with that, the UN is arguing that there's, like 1 million people in high levels of food insecurity.
Yeah, they mentioned food insecurity, but then they also, how many warnings were there about? So, the warnings for like stage 5 famine were taken down, weren't they? I thought the UN said that they don't have enough evidence to judge that right now.
Recently, sure, but the part of the point is that if that's how a war starts and how a war goes for say 4 months, I don't know that you can assume that the state has a high regard for civilian life. As a heuristic, I think the kind of state that's willing to do that, do these mass movements without providing for civilians, is probably not the kind of state to have a high respect for civilians.
But when you say they were allowing for that movement without providing for civilians, I don't know where that's coming from.
Because when you are trying to move, it was like 1 million people over the course of, I think, like 2 days.
I don't think they gave it. I don't think there was a set time limit.
I mean, I now I'm not recalling, but when I recall that it was a massive amount of people expected to move extremely quickly.
I mean, there was something that went around the press for a while saying 24 hours, but I mean, I think when you looked at the flyers that were given to people in Arabic, I don't think 24 hours was there. It might have been. But even then, like if you're evacuate, like you can do your evacuation, you can have it ongoing. Even if people haven't fully evacuated yet, you're still not supposed to just start blasting places that might have civilians in them, unless there's like enough military infrastructure around it for it to pass a proportionality test.
Sure. So
this is what I mean. It just feels like I don't know everything about international law, and it feels like, well, definitely compared to previous wars in Gaza, they're doing things differently. We know that because they've never had this rate of killing before, and they've never had this rate of what seems to be high collateral death before. The way that they they're not even trying with like roof knocks anymore. I think they still make phone calls, but I can see when it comes to that whole thing about like when they say it's not a safe zone, it's actually a safer zone we're sending them to, right? There's only one safe zone, but everything else is a safer zone when they tell people to move. But on the flyers in Arabic, they just say safe zone. Now, I don't know if that's criminal in some way. Like it probably should be. But this isn't the discourse that's going around in the Green Party or like in the ceasefire, like arms embargo camp. It just seems like massively like incoherent, and I guess people just see lots of people dying and they don't really know who to blame exactly because, like Hamas has a responsibility for their civilians as well, and they're the ones who don't want to stop the war either, it seems. So, I don't know. I just feel like this, like, especially coming back to the Greens, I don't feel like this contributes anything to the discussion. I think it just makes things worse.
Well, so just on the Palestine bit before we pivot back, like Human Rights Watch, it's possible they got it wrong, but they say, quote, on Friday, the Israeli army ordered more than 1 million people to leave northern Gaza within 24 hours in advance of an imminent military ground operation. You're saying that it said differently on the pamphlets, which is totally possible. As well, the UN on the same day, the UN OCHA said, quote, the order to evacuate 1.1 million people from northern Gaza defies the rules of war and basic humanity. Continuing, there's nowhere safe to go. Without safe passage and access to basic services, such mass displacement of civilians will have catastrophic humanitarian consequences. So I'm not trying to, like, you might be right about some of the details that it's like, I don't know, let's say it's like 15% less bad. To me, this is just like atrocious, even if it's slightly less atrocious.
Because the problem is that it's assuming a lot of things, right? It's assuming that it was actually 24 hours, which I still don't think I ever saw the hard evidence for. I don't know how that started to circulate. Maybe someone can show me the original source for it. But because, like, again, a human rights sources, they're circulating things that they've got from other people, right? Like that's where they get what they've heard about the war. As far as aid goes and like the humanitarian possibility of moving that many people at once, well, that depends on whether or not there was sufficient aid getting into the south. And it didn't seem like, now that you've got like 1.5, 2 million people displaced, that stage 5 famine didn't seem to have happened. I think the Gaza Health Ministry at one point, I think they counted like 30 deaths from malnutrition in the worst areas, maybe 40. So,
I mean, I do know that like some of the concerns there about long-term deaths or premature deaths or like stunted growth from malnutrition as well. Like when people cite the Lancet number, they often treat it as if those are people currently dead, whereas the Lancet number is an extrapolation of, well, in similar war conditions, there was ultimately a mortality of like X many times the number displaced or whatever.
Yeah, it's also assuming a certain rate. Like if you went at the rate of the first half of the war and just applied that, then that would make sense. But I don't think doesn't seem to be what's happening now. It seems to be now that, like, most American intel seems to agree that Israel has achieved about as much as they can militarily with Hamas. All it is going to be now with targeting militants will be like whack-a-mole with small strikes. So I don't think we're going back to your like first couple of months of the war situation anymore.
Well, actually, on that last bit, you mentioned like what kind of ceasefire would I want? And you suggested, well, one possibility is that if there is too strong a ceasefire, so to speak, that Hamas will just rebuild. But it doesn't seem like Israel has been able to like remove Hamas anyway, right? Like it doesn't seem like that was ever possible, unless Israel is planning to like put a Fatah government in there by force or something. I don't know what the actual plan is. I don't know how you're actually going to like quote unquote get rid of Hamas when your description of Hamas is that like they're in all the refugee camps, that they're like scattered throughout the population, that they're not clearly delineated.
Yeah, they're
Like,
they're a
short-
civilian government as well as a military. Yeah, they're like a de facto government, social service. Yeah, everything. Yeah, they're very embedded. Yeah, yeah, I agree. That's like even Yoav Gallant said that. Mr. Total Siege guy said that you can't defeat Hamas with just guns. Yeah, and that's where I think people like Kamala and where even people within Netanyahu's own government, people who have resigned from the war cabinet and why the war cabinet is not even there anymore, is people who are saying that this is not the way to go forward with it. But I can see those criticisms coming from people like Kamala, and this is the kind of discussion I think that is actually valuable towards helping people in the strip and making sure that it isn't just like a endless fighting and playing whack-a-mole for no reason. But yeah, like this is the discussion I think people should be having. But what you just said right now, which we're not getting from the likes of like your Jill Steins and all the rest of it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it's because the fact of like the fact of the bombardment that's like still ongoing, that when it does hit, it seems to be so brutal. I think it's just inherently deeply appalling. And like, if your argument, how do I put it like this? You are super politically plugged in. I think the average person, when they see stuff that seems like war crimes and atrocities, it's just like, holy shit, this needs to stop, which is what the average American voter thinks.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so maybe you're right that like this isn't the highest quality discourse that could possibly be generated. At another level, like, I don't know, the level of discourse that like Trump generates or Kamala generates on like, say, the debate stage is also just not very high quality. Like, it's the limits of political debate are pretty low in terms of quality. And so I think people should be like, hey, I'm against this. It seems to be generating a lot of atrocities. I don't know. I think that's like a fine impulse, even if the details are not super worked out. I mean, Stein, again, is obviously not a serious candidate, right? Like, what was the thing? She didn't even know how many people in the House of Representatives there are. She's obviously just a protest vote anyway. So I don't know. I take that as basically fine, that people are really, really pissed at something. And I will just note that even though people are really pissed at it, I think one reason that a lot of people get really mad at Stein is that they're worried that she's a spoiler. And what I was trying to get at is that Stein is currently polling around 1%. Third-party candidates usually underperform their polls by around 2 to 3 times. If she gets 0.5%, and we see a similar like proportion of voters who would have voted for the Dem as in Clinton, then the net margin is on the order of like 0.1% of voters, which you could get 0.1% of voters by doing like anything. The FBI letter might have moved 1% of voters, 10 times as many in the 2016 election. So yes, there might be a spoiler effect, but it's going to be really, really, really small, almost certainly.
I hope you're right, because it seems to be right now that the election is very close and that Jill Stein is leading to Kamala amongst Muslim voters in swing states, which is where the Democrats seem to be the most vulnerable right now because of that like toxicity around that discourse around Palestine. Well,
yeah, but I mean, like I think that there's some justification. Like, again, the fact that Democrats, let me put it like this: if everything you say about Israel changing its way of war is correct, and that was due to like Dem pressure, I think that it's reasonable for people to be pissed that it was like, hey, this took a year for us to get here, right? Or like 6 months, however long you want to argue that it took so long, when the US as a world hegemon, like we've been willing to impose way harsher sanctions for way lesser violations of people's well-being. So I don't know. I think that it is fine to be pissed at Democrats for it. I don't know.
But I don't know if that's the case, because I think Democrats so far have done better than someone like Jill Stein would have, because...
Well, but I don't. The comparison isn't Jill Stein versus the Democrats. I think that maybe like a tiny percentage of people are genuinely think that she's like a real candidate. But I think the point is, as a protest vote, it's to say, hey, you lean way too strongly towards Israel. You can even look at it in how they covered like Israeli versus Palestinian deaths. Like, how often has Biden empathized with Palestinian suffering versus how quickly has he promoted Israeli lies? Like, he's still promoting that he saw, like, what was it, like, beheaded and burned babies?
I think he said the beheaded baby there was a burned baby. There was at least one, maybe two.
Sure. He said he saw pictures like day one.
Yeah, he said he saw he said he saw a video of a baby getting beheaded, or a picture of it. Yeah, and that turned out, obviously, he probably just saw that on Twitter. Yeah. But I mean, it's like a jerk reaction on the day of October 7th. Like,
that's
I mean,
fair.
how many media sources said
point.
How many media sources suggested that Israel had like direct struck a hospital and killed 500 people at Al-Ali? Right? They didn't do that.
I think there's a lot of misinformation in this. It is, how do I put it like this? It seems like the bias in Mr. Biden and in many people in the Democratic Party is very much towards accepting the lies you initially get from Israel rather than the lies you initially get from like sex and campus types. And so, like, I don't know. I do think it is okay to be frustrated at that. There's very obviously People pointed out the type of bias that you see in headlines all the time, where there's active tense when Russia kills a kid, but there's passive tense whenever a kid dies in occupied Palestine. And I don't know. Again, I think it's okay to be frustrated with that kind of thing. I don't think it's productive to risk like letting Trump in, right? Because he's almost certainly even worse, and he's even worse in like 20 odd ways. At the same time, I think that's the frustration people are trying to voice, and I think it's a pretty real frustration when again, I'm saying it's like 1 in 10 people in Palestine have been injured or killed. It's like 80% of the buildings have been damaged. I think that's really real.
I think it was about the 50 was the last time I saw for the buildings, but yeah, I'm looking at the thing.
The damage is much higher. The destroyed is
no, just like damaged and destroyed included. I think is like 50-60%. Yeah, that's from Unistat the last time I checked, unless it's just rocketed up since then. But I mean, people were saying 70% like 6 months ago. So like even this with the aid trucks, I'm looking at it now. Like September before, the month before October 7th, you've got 2,000 food aid trucks going in. And then you go to 2024, January, you've got over 3,000. February, you've got just about 2,000. And then in March, you've got close to 4,000. Yeah, it seems this idea that they were blocking aid.
If you're showing something, I'm not actually looking.
I'm just looking at. So I'm just saying that like that. It just feels like so many of these attacks are like they're made up. Like I don't know what to. Fuck. The problem with the trucks is that people confused all trucks with aid trucks because before October 7th they used to put in everything, concrete, like electrical equipment and everything that you need for infrastructure. But obviously because there's a war on, they're not sending concrete in that might get picked up by Hamas or whoever else. So now it's like gone down to food. So the total number of trucks has gone down, but the number of aid trucks has gone up. Obviously you have to make up for local production and shit like that as well, which they have done. Like they've allowed that. But yeah, that's one of those misconceptions that just keeps running around.
I mean, if so good, my understanding is there was a period of several months where it was way lower.
There was like October. I think. Let me have. You can look at October. I think it was October, November, maybe December 2023, and then it goes back. So if you look at October, you've got.
But again, to me, that seems like a 3-month period of no food or very limited aid in food is like just not a good sign for respect for civilian life. Like I just, that was the reason I was trying to bring it up. Not saying that Israel has done the worst possible thing they could do, right? They could just be starving the people there, but more that this is like beyond the norm, beyond the pale.
So so September before October 7th, you had 2,200 trucks. October, it goes way down to 800. And then November, you're back up to 1,700. December, you're over 2,000 again. And that's not even to mention, aid went down massively on October, but that you could blame Israel for that. How do we know it's not also because there were a million breaches in the fence because a de facto state military broke through a border and attacked another country? Like, yeah, of course it's gonna be more difficult to get aid trucks in those circumstances. They destroyed some of the crossings.
I mean, that could definitely be true. I'm trying to find. Man, I was keeping a tally of these somewhere, but I can't find the sheet. I am totally willing to agree with you that it is more complicated, that the decline is almost certainly not just due to Israelis' malfeasance or like attempt to hurt Palestinians. At the same time, the fact that it did decline, the fact that the first emphasis for months and months and months and months was just kill as many leaders as we can. The fact that you got things like the Jabilah camp bomb with like it's just ridiculously high ratio of acceptable civilian dead, and like I believe it was even 100 dead, and it was like 400 injured or something. A ridiculously high civilian casualty ratio. Even if you think that there was a high number of militants somewhere involved in that, that's a huge number of people injured or killed.
Yeah, and I think this was what did Biden. This is why I think it was in June, wasn't it, when Biden started to withhold some weapons because he did that whole spiel about how you shouldn't use 2,000-pound bombs in these areas because definitely by American standards, because they have like the whole NCV thing, where they're like they can only have a set number of civilian collateral for each target. So Biden said that, and that's why he withheld those arms that were more likely to do that with the 2,000-pound bombs. So. Yeah, he did that. But I feel like the problem is the discourse has just been so dominated by people who they have there's no appeasing them, right? Because as long as the war continues, or even as long as there are operations in the West Bank, even if it's basically everyone who's getting killed as a militant, it's always like Palestinians dying, Like this isn't the destruction of Israel or the blockade or the embargo or the one-state solution that we want. Yeah, like it's like the maximalism is really, really toxic in this situation.
Well, sure, I agree that there is some maximalism. At the same time, so you're right at one level that it could be that a higher proportion of militants are being killed. Part of the problem, I think, especially for people on the political left, is that they think Israel's credibility is shot. That because of its actions earlier in the war, that it, like when it was claiming that it was just killing Hamas militants, when it was releasing all of these things, like was it bombed a hospital and then it released like a diagram of the hospital, like explaining why it was totally okay to do it. That like Israel kept releasing this footage of
Al-Shifa, the tunnel.
Yes, just there's early in the war, Israel was producing a huge amount of propaganda that just in my mind at least it like very, very much discredited it. And definitely like seeing the same thing happen from the other side, that there was the misfired rocket that hit the hospital that was blamed on Israel. Again, I think I don't put a lot of faith in the credibility of the other side either, but if the only source we have to go on for like, hey, we're killing fewer civilians now is Israel, then it's just not very credible. It'd be like if Russia said, like, Russia hasn't accepted any credibility for any civilians killed in the Syrian war. So if Russia then went on to say that like they have a very low civilian kill rate in the Syrian war, you're like, well, how much credibility do you have? Have you been doing the work for 12 years to publish this? No. So why should I care?
What was the propaganda around the hospital?
Oh God, I barely remember. I should be keeping this somewhere.
Is this the tunnel network under the main hospital, Al-Shifa, the command and control center? Is that what you're referring to?
That might be.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was going to come on.
Okay, no, I'm sorry. I was just going to.
I was trying. No. I'm not trying to say that I'm walking out of it. It was more that you were like, "Hey, is there a Stein voter?" I'm like, "Well, technically, I could be a Stein voter, and I could more importantly, promote the strategy of vote trading." Okay, if you know any green friends and you're a Dem in a blue state, vote for Jill Stein. Get them to vote blue. Okay.
Listen, that's like the most idiosyncratic Stein voter I've ever come across. That's a Stein voter who wants the Democrats to win by exploiting green voters in purple states. That's based. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm an even stronger Democratic voter than most of y'all, right? I'm actually doubling the power of my Democrat vote.
Yeah. There actually were tunnels found underneath the Al-Shifa hospital. For some reason, I think because people, I don't know what happened. I don't know. This my brain is so fucked on these arguments. Like, I think it's because they said command and control center that people thought there was going to be some kind of like Bond villain bunker in there. Even though the 3D graphic they show you of their command and control center is just a room with a table and 4 laptops. Like, I don't know. Sorry, that's not you. That's just me molding. Yeah. Tell you what, the reason I'm frustrated about it, also because I guess it's like Jill Stein's kind of big thing. I don't think she'd have a foot in the door at all. I don't think she'd be in the discourse were it not for Gaza. I think that's her way in because it's a popular issue. It's really frustrating that like I've never, notice for Palestinians, like I've never seen such a disproportion between the amount of international support they have from people versus the lack of results. All this international support and all this political capital, and it just goes nowhere.
But I think the reason for that's pretty simple, right? It's that so long as the U.S. is willing to back it, nothing's going to change.
No, that's not why. It's because people don't know what the fuck is happening and they don't know what they want. Like, or they don't have reasonable demands. That's it. Like, yeah.
I mean, I agree that it's more complicated than many simplistic approaches to it demand. I will just note that that's almost certainly true on the Zionist side as well. Like, I've been listening to C-SPAN a lot, and whenever you hear Republicans talk about Israel, it is the most banal, like a pro-apartheid, like Palestinians are non-civilized people that I've ever heard. Mm-hmm. To me, when I look at what is it, AIPAC, I think has donated to like 86% of American politicians. When you look at the votes in the House, that I want to say the percent of people who said that calling Israel apartheid is anti-Semitic and racist, it was like 80% approval or something. When you have the world superpower that is like almost unanimously on the side of maintaining some kind of like something like the Israeli state, and like its military and its current like very, very lightly treading on criticizing Israel. I think when you have something like that, then yeah, like the amount of international support you get is going to be really, really muted relative to the results you get, because it's like you have one of the world's most powerful countries supporting it.
Yeah, but that goes both ways, though. I mean, first of all, at least with the Israeli right, their demands from America are quite clear, right? They want to annex more territory in the West Bank and move the embassy to Jerusalem and get the Golan Heights recognized. And if they get Republican in, they can get all that. They can get that from Trump. When it comes to the far left, they can make demands And some of which I think, like, there has been a move. We've both acknowledged that with Biden and sanctioning settlers and holding back on more heavy munitions like the 2,000-pound bombs. But the problem is there's no the Democrats don't actually have that much incentive to go that hard in Israel because they've done all these changes. They haven't been able to deal with the Jill Stein wing and they haven't been able to recuperate the Muslim vote or the vote from like the very far left. But they have lost Jewish voters. They've lost a lot of Jewish voters. This is like the lowest proportion of Jewish votes for the Democrats since the 80s, isn't it?
Well, no. So all of that's like okay, let me put it like this. There's like three misconceptions there. One is that they've lost the far left. This is not true. I put out an article recently called "Most Socialists Will Vote for Kamala Harris," which shows that roughly the same portion of people. It's hard to get exact numbers, but roughly the same portion of people who are socialists probably voted for Trump okay, I'm phrasing this poorly. 90% of socialists say they're going to vote for Kamala Harris. That is roughly the same portion of Sanders voters who ended up voting for Clinton. There is a lot of evidence that it's more or less the same. And like, there's just hasn't been a huge defection or whatever. Now it's possible that it could have been 95% or whatever, but for Gaza. But again, I feel like, but for Gaza is actually a relatively important thing given the scale of human suffering. So just, there hasn't been a mass defection there. Then on there's something called, I believe, the Jewish Democrat Institute. I can pull these polls in a second if you need them. The portion of Jewish Americans who say they're going to vote for Harris is around 75%, or it was actually around 69% who said they would vote for Biden in 2020. Like, support among Jewish people, if anything, is higher. I think the net margin is even higher than that. Like, it was like a slight decline for Trump. So that's just not true. The only group they have lost is Muslim voters. And again, that's because of but for Gaza being actually a really important issue. And Muslim voters are they're really, really pissed. So it's not true that the left is defecting. It's not true that Jews are defecting. It's just Muslims.
Wait, hang on.
Which, justified, baby.
Was that where was the poll that I got from that then for the Jewish voters? I was sure that I saw this was maybe going to be their lowest proportion of Jewish voters since the 80s. Still the majority, but just not as big as majority as before, no? Or where we can look that up together, actually. I just want to double check.
So here is jewishdems.org.
Jewishdems.org.
And they have been working with this thing called the Jewish Electoral Institute. So here, I'll send you my notes with it as well, rather than just a link. My summary was in September 2020, which is the closest you get to the election from the JEI, is that it was 67% Biden, 30% Trump. Then in 2024, it was 67% Biden, 26% Trump. So actually a slight shift, if you believe the polls, towards Biden, like on net, by about like 2 points. And then for Harris, it was 72% Harris, 25% Trump. So she even improved from Biden, which may not be surprising just because Biden had other candidate quality issues, right? It could be for other reasons, but there just doesn't seem to be any strong evidence that, like, at least from Democrat-leaning pollsters, I will be clear, there is probably a partisan bias here, but I don't know whether the bias is strong enough to like make it stronger over time. At least from this pollster, there hasn't been any change. And the reason I care about that is I want to have like one pollster over time rather than looking at like Gallup versus Pew or something, because maybe there's some other difference in how they're polling. Yeah,
because already here, like I can see leaning Harris is 65% Jewish from Pew, and this is from the end of August till early September. That's actually that's like 10 points, isn't it? Difference, or almost.
It's a big difference, but it's partly because Jewish people are only like, what is it, like 2% of the U.S. population? They're a minority. It's hard.
They're all in fucking blue states anyway. It doesn't fucking matter. Whatever. Okay. Jewish electorate 67 Biden. So if it's 67, yeah, because this is the problem. Is like the Pew poll suggests that it suggests it is a drop, whereas the other one suggests it's
actually. So the thing is, you want to look at one pollster over time,
I know,
right?
Yeah.
That's what I say. You want to look at Pew poll Jewish voters 2020, Pew poll Jewish voters Biden, Pew poll Jewish voters Harris.
Let's have a look at this one. For Jewish Americans, Biden still preferred. Haaretz, was it Haaretz? Well, this is 71 for both secular and religious Jews. Democrat. So it would be 71 to 65 from Pew. I can link these two if you want.
I mean, of course.
I'm shit at reading polls. In any case, I think the point probably still stands that there's only so far that Kamala can cede to the pro-Palestine crowd without losing, if not Jewish voters, more moderate Democrats, even like the more right-leaning Democrats, even the moderate Republicans, because there's currently an exodus of moderate Republicans who are fed up of Trump, right? Including your Dick Cheneys and shit. But I don't even bother arguing about that, because the thing I'd rather argue about is like what I think is morally correct. But yeah, we can talk about.
The only thing I would add is, again, one of the differences you got to care about is identify as Democrat versus willing to vote for Biden, willing to vote for Trump. Because again, Trump can sometimes have weirdly high or weirdly low candidate quality among different groups. That's all. But like you can't just take the percent of Dems Jews in 2020 and compare it to percent of Biden stand Jews in 2024. That's all.
Okay.
I know you understand all this. I understand polling's complicated. What I would say is this: if there has been a massive decline of Jewish people, it probably hasn't been picked up by polls. Like, so if there is a decline, it's probably like less than 5%, and it's possible, in my view, that there's been an increase again around 5%. So like, just not very strong evidence that there's been a big like Jexodus, I think is what they tried to call
Jexodus.
Yes.
Do you think, this is just a vibes question, do you think it would be, it could happen if enough ground was ceded to the uncommitted movement or the Jill Stein world or whatever else?
Funnily enough, like, the answer is yes for enough ground under some definition, right? If Harris came out tomorrow and called for nuking Israel, like Mr. V, then yes, she might lose some Jewish voters.
Well, even if she called for like an arms embargo, like just we're no longer Israel's friend.
But so I don't know. Like I don't know the answer. I will say that in the Jewish in the JEI polls that I linked, Israel is the 9th of 11 issues for Jewish voters. I think people have a propensity to think that Jewish voters care a lot more about Israel than the average American, and they do care more than the average American, but not a lot more. They like fundamentally Jewish voters are liberal people with like socially liberal and economically liberal views. That's the reason they vote down. And yeah, they do have more of an identity tie to Israel than other people, but not like it. I actually kind of try and push back on this because I feel like it can lead into the sort of dual loyalty type stuff you get from the far right and sometimes the far left. That like Jewish people care more about Israel than they do as like Americans or whatever. No, they're just like liberal voters.
Where are they on? How high is anti-Semitism on that list?
I don't know if it was. A very high proportion in both of the polls cared about anti-Semitism. I don't think it was included in the same like issue ranking though.
Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't included in that ranking. So in 2020, 80% of Jewish voters were worried about anti-Semitism and white nationalism. In 2024, it was 91%. Though I will just note that some of that is probably concern over the far right rising. Like, I don't know. If 10% of Jewish voters are on Twitter, I have a good idea of why they're worried about the rise of anti-Semitism.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on the Democrats' platform besides Palestine on other issues?
I mean, it was silly that they dropped execution. They dropped a whole bunch of dumb things like opposition to capital punishment. They dropped the public option. That's really dumb. I have no idea why Harris is dropping that. It's frustrating because that's something she could point to. Minnesota began rolling out a public option. That maybe she didn't want to have it because Walz actually delayed it by 1 year, so she doesn't want to crow about it when he stopped it from being implemented. But Minnesota like authorized a public option. I think 6 other Dem states authorized or began implementing a very weak public option. Minnesota's would have been the first that was like a true public option, like you have in European countries. If he just signed off on it, please. So I don't know. I was sad to see those. I feel it's a large document. If you want all the criticism, I'm happy to list them. But it was frustrating because the public option is a very popular thing. Just
so I've heard, yeah.
So it's frustrating, right? Because it feels like this is an easy issue where you can win on Trump. Just keep public option in there, right? When he says, "Oh, what was his line? I have a concept of a plan for how to repeal and replace Obamacare." If you just said, "Well, I have a concept of a plan. It's called a public option," that would be nice. But she can't say that because all she's doing is defending the status quo.
When you say drop the public option, does that just mean she's not going to put it before Congress, or she's not going to allow it, or will it matter what other Democrats think? What does that mean?
I mean, you were just asking about the platform, I think, and it's just not in there.
It's just not on the Okay.
At least, I mean, when I checked, now I'm doubting myself. Dem platform 2024. Yeah, like the phrase is just not in there, and it's frustrating. And Dems continue to do the like we believe in a human right thing, but just link it to a concrete policy, right? Like she's promoted all sorts of dumb policies, like the tariffs on China and the no tax on tips. At least put this one good policy in there, please. I'm begging.
Yeah, I mean, I feel good about the child tax credits and all those kind of things, like the expansion of childcare, etc. But I don't understand the price gouging thing. I imagine that's going to be a policy that's just going to have very little reach. But
I'm like my hope is that it never sees the light of day. But if it does see the light of day, that it's the equivalent of her. What was it that she said? Like Pell grants for people who started a startup for 3 years in an underserved minority community. Do that, but for price gouging, please.
Yeah, or just like. What would you even call it?
Oh my God.
It's Econoboi. It's this guy.
Listen, SDL is sharing anti-Kamala propaganda on your channel, LonerBox. I can't allow it.
About public option?
No, I'm just kidding. I think one thing I wanted to posit to you guys is like, okay, in some regards, I wonder if Kamala and Tim are hiding their power level because, and the reason I say this, I cannot imagine that you go into office with a unified Democratic government. Let's just say we keep the seat in Montana, we keep the 50 seats, and we win the House by some margin. I cannot imagine you go into that and the Democrats say, we're going to expand the child tax credit, including a one-time payment, and then that's basically all we're going to do. Like, we're going to maybe do some stuff with capital gains taxes. We're going to do, like, the most minor of anti-price gouging, like antitrust stuff with the food industry. And then that's, like, all that we do, right? Because Tim Walz, when he ran for governor, he ran as quite a moderate person, obviously representing that rural district. Comes into office, turns out we had friggin' classic Minnesota rural, Walz, who was hiding his power level, doing all these different forms of welfare expansion in Minnesota. And the Democrats have such a skinny platform, it makes me wonder if they're going to get into office and maybe do something, bigger than basically what they campaigned on.
I mean, that's the dream, right? But the problem is that the federal government is just it has so many more barriers to passing laws. For one, you've got the Republican Supreme Court. For two, you've got the filibuster.
But you can do a lot of reconciliation stuff. You could do a public option through reconciliation. You could do massive welfare expansion through reconciliation. Biden did the IRA, the biggest climate investment through reconciliation, right? So you could do a huge amount. If the filibuster affects basically only essentially non-fiscal issues, you could obviously...
Well, sure, that's why I was pleased. And I don't know if she's backed off on it. Like Harris, at least a few years ago, was saying that we should override the filibuster to pass voting rights laws, which I would love to see actually happen. I don't know whether there's enough Democrats to make it happen.
I would love the filibuster to get overturned. I just, I don't know. That's one of the reasons why I'm very skeptical on like protecting abortion rights or voting rights or anything like that. It's because the Democrats are just really scared to get rid of the filibuster. But at least it's just, I don't know. It would seem crazy to me if the Democrats had a unified government and like all they did was like, we're just going to do the child tax credit and that's it. That would be like a Trump level of, legislative accomplishment. It's like, I did the one tax cut bill.
How much of what Biden did was on paper before he became president? Like the executive order for gender identity for trans people, or the fucking infrastructure and the CHIPS Act and all that. Like, how much of what he did was actually on the thing before he got president?
I'm not super familiar. To be clear, all I was trying to do was critique like the platform. My bet is that Harris, like Econoboi says, probably still supports a public option. She was willing to say she supported Medicare for all. Now, whether that was cynical, I don't know. But my bet is that she's willing to support a public option because she's willing to support someone like Walz, who was at least nominally in favor of it. Because she was like, Biden was at least willing to say he was in favor of it. So I'm not trying to say that they won't do more, just more that like the platform I thought was a shift to the right, frustratingly. On a lot of economic policy, and even like I mentioned, they got rid of stuff like opposition to the death penalty, opposition to torture, which are just like, I don't know, those are pretty popular positions. You can just leave them in. You can do a little Control-C, Control-V. They did that with the policy page. Just do that with the platform.
Yeah, sure, but I don't think that.
I will say on that one, I have heard from DNC delegates that it was just sort of like those aren't a priority issue.
It's very low salience.
Yeah, and so. I get that. It just does frustrate me. Insofar,
I don't think Kamala is going to be like, we're going to bring back, execution.
Well,
like,
all she really needs is one execution by official order, and it would solve a lot of.
Right. She's not going to like order 66 the fucking Senate or something. I don't think. But I think overall, though, I do wonder personally if the Democrats could get away with campaigning a little bit more radically than they do now. In part, though, I think we might disagree on why, though, SDL, because I think that's in part because of the polarized environment. It's like, look, we're already polarized. You probably could campaign on literally almost any conceivable thing as the Democrats or the Republicans. And like, maybe it's a news story for one day, and then what's going to happen from there, right? But it seems like what the Democrats have chosen is like the opposite, where it's like, we're going to run on this like super skinny platform that's very difficult to critique with any sort of long tail, with any sort of salience. And like, ideally, hopefully do a little bit more than what is in the platform, obviously going into office.
Look, I'm happy to share in that hope. And, I'm certain that whatever, if Dems get in, the policy outcomes are almost certain to be better than what would come out of a Trump or Republican administration. Like, no doubt. I do agree with you that it can be useful, possibly, to avoid putting like super unpopular policies in the platform. At the same time, the reason I was mad about stuff like the public option is that feels like an easy win. Like, it's popular. If it does get you one day, it is a good day. It is one good day of coverage, right? Like, it's not one bad day.
I guess
Yeah, I'm
the
wondering
Dems
why
are
that's
just
not there.
scared.
Is that because they're scared of every right move I can see right now from Kamala Walls is because they're afraid of losing all the moderate Republicans that are ditching Trump?
I mean,
But,
I'm certain it's
yeah.
a calculation. Absolutely.
yeah, okay.
I don't know if that's the only thing though, because I think that part of it is like we want this election to be about Trump, right? And if we have a Bernie style platform where it's like, 20 different major policy changes, Medicare for all, whatever, some Green New Deal type thing, it's like, okay, well, now we're having to defend tax increases on the middle class, which are very defensible, of course, but it's very difficult for the layman to come out. I compare it to when LBJ ran for re-election after Kennedy got assassinated, even though he was pretty popular, if you look at his platform, at least the official release platform, talks about cutting taxes, it talks about debureaucratization, this kind of thing. But then he actually wins, and then he does the Great Society after that, right? Because even in the 1960s, even immediately preceding, LBJ's historic election, and then Kennedy getting assassinated, even in that environment, it was like, yeah, we can't be running on increasing taxes and providing services to people. And he just ends up doing it anyway, and now Medicare is still around 60 years later, because it turns out, just for some reason, it's some behavioral reason, like you just can't seem to advocate for increasing taxes and increasing services, but when you actually do those things in office, people tend to not mind them. I compare it to like the Republicans never run on lowering taxes for the rich, but they always do. And they don't seem to face very significant electoral consequences for doing it, right? So I think Democrats probably should do the same thing, right? It's just like try to have a more expansive governance than you have platform. And it's like, what are the Republicans going to do at the point of a public option? What, are you just going to get rid of it? They haven't gotten rid of Obamacare, right? Republican states haven't gotten rid of Medicaid expansion. It's like, you just can't seem to do that, right? That'd be crazy if they did that.
What's the polling for public option right now?
I'm not sure, SDL. What have you seen recently?
Yeah, I didn't ask you. I asked the guy who knows all the fucking poll data.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well,
what
you
I
didn't
thought.
say SDL. You said,
If I ask about a
poll?
fucking poll, it's for SDL because he knows all the polls.
I know a lot of polls, LB. I'll have
well,
you know.
You said you were
What the
off on
fuck,
the wrong
brother?
foot then, clearly. Okay.
So the big thing that I don't know. When I last looked
Wow,
at
the
it,
poll
PFF
guy doesn't know, LB. Would you look at that? Maybe you should have asked old Econoboi about that poll.
The
Probably
reason I
should have
wanted to
asked
ask is
fucking
that
neither of you, but okay.
there is evidence that there's a decent amount of framing effect with public option type stuff, like depending on how you frame it. So like Kaiser Family Foundation had a bunch of great polls in that in 2020. And I honestly haven't looked for new ones since because they were so good.
Yeah, the only ones I can see on 2021 are like 49, 47 and shit. Like if it's still that, then I can see why they don't want to make a big noise about it. As opposed to abortion, right, which is like 70% for first trimester.
Yeah. And I guess to be fair, it's also to their advantage because Trump seems like genuinely incapable of making any sort of substantive critique. I think it's a pretty broad statement, but I feel like there's just like he does not seem to be able to make a substantive critique against like anything the Democrats do because he just doesn't seem to understand it. Obviously, he can waffle on a lot of stuff, but it seems like he's not going to like Trump is never going to say something like the unrealized capital gains tax erodes, aggregate investment, and that's bad for the economy. It's going to lead to unemployment. He's going to say, the unrealized capital gains tax is Marxist. It's going to turn us communist. It's going to collapse the government and the economy.
Based?
Right.
Yeah, I
But
mean,
it's
as long
like-
as they have like a little bit more fucking policies than the Republicans, so they don't get to say there's no policy, then yeah, that's probably all you need.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm curious how this strategy will work out, like on the exit polls and stuff. I just ultimately, I guess, like one reason I'm skeptical of it is because I just don't know how much people actually vote on policy. I really don't. Like people always say this.
No
you
one
should
in
focus
America votes on
policies.
policy. You guys are the most retarded fucking nation on the planet. Like you all vote, like you're all just like soying out over the fact that like one of the candidates is talking about fucking transing illegal migrants in prisons, aliens, and
Based?
they're like, this guy's got a chance to handle the
Hey,
economy
listen,
and the
hey.
border and the military and the fucking Middle East and Palestine. Jesus Christ.
Hey, look, we've never had 14 years of straight conservative rule, LB, like the island that you live on.
Sorry,
all
I
right?
know
We
that
kicked our
conservatives
conservatives out after 4 or 8 years, sir.
Yeah, I know that conservatives is a dirty word to you guys, but at least our conservatives, you know what happens when they lose elections? They leave. Our conservative
hey.
fucking conceded before Labour had even crossed the threshold. He
You know,
conceded
honestly,
before they even got the majority.
Your Labor was like it was like a 90% to like 1%. Okay, he was like a bug being crushed beneath Keir Starmer's
Yeah,
steel-toed
true.
boot.
Yeah.
Here's Starmer, more right wing than Biden.
Yeah, he is, isn't he? Fucking dick.
I think in
got
a relative
him.
sense, yeah.
Little
it's
kid
like how they want to
starver.
run the
That's what I
system.
call him. Yeah. I mean, he's I saw he recently cut what was it, the winter fuel allowance or something.
Wait,
He's
I mean,
getting into
you
hot
say,
trouble.
sorry, you say that, but then again, you guys are like a public option. Imagine having to care about anything in terms of paying
Yeah,
for
that's
healthcare.
why like Keir Starmer is like centrist in a system which is 2 steps left.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's kind of like my fundamental point is that, you know, you look at Attlee coming into office, you know, socialist labor prime minister like 100 years ago or some shit, right? You know, 90 years ago, I guess. And he you know, he nationalizes the health industry and like provides the service to people and does so many other things. And, you know, it's 80, 90 years down the road and like multiple, you know, many, you know, decades worth of conservative governments never got rid of the NHS you know, ever, or the taxes associated with it. Obviously there's some cutbacks and things like that. And they probably don't run the NHS as well as like a Labor government does, at least by the data that I'm familiar with. But that's kind of my point though, is that Democrats in America ideally would learn the same thing. I think one of the issues is that Democrats, when they govern only slightly less scared than they campaign. Whereas Republicans seem to do the opposite, where Republicans, when they get into office, they're like, yeah, fuck it. We'll pass a huge tax cut for the rich. Who gives a shit what the effects on the budget are? Yeah, we'll cut taxes on corporations. I don't care what the polls say about that. Yeah, we'll try to just get rid of Obamacare, and that only fails by 1 vote. Who gives a fuck, right? Like, they'll just try to do everything that they basically want, and they're only constrained by essentially institutional strength and maybe some, at the margin, sort of moderate Republicans in the House or, you know, sort of key constituencies or something. But Democrats, when they get into office, and that's one thing that was so refreshing about Biden, is that Biden, he seemed at least willing to propose and extendedly fight for massive welfare expansion. You know, he proposed trillions of dollars of additional welfare spending, and, you know, there was months and months and months of negotiation before we eventually get, you know, some skinny version of it with, you know, like the IRA and infrastructure bill and, you know, stuff like that, right? But so hopefully Kamala and Tim, if they get into office, they'll be able to govern a little bit, you know, hopefully a little bit more radically, certainly to the left of Keir Starmer, LonerBox.
Yeah.
Right.
Listen, we're on a bit
Goodness.
of a soul-searching episode right now in the UK.
I mean, so Econoboi, you know, you mentioned a lot of the state policies. That's one of the reasons that I'm hesitant to think that Democrats are going to do massive change in office. Like I've made those graphs of where Democrats have partisan control versus where they've passed, say, like paid family leave, where they've passed public options. And, you know, it's only like I think it's like 1 in 2 Dem states have paid family leave nowadays. It's only like 1 in 4 have even a start of a public option. It just,
Well, state level public options are, and my understanding is that state level public options are pretty difficult to actually get done because your funding constraint seems pretty rough, especially when your citizens have to pay federal taxes. And obviously, look, getting rid of the SALT deduction is a good thing, sort of nationally speaking, but it does limit the fiscal space even more, probably, of state level policies. And so I do feel like there are probably certain policies that, I mean, of course this is the case, that there are certain policies that the federal government can do, but state level governments probably couldn't do in a very effective way. And I mean, you know, like in, for instance, like people, you know, I think it was like in the mid 2000s or something, Colorado, they actually voted for a pretty straight single payer healthcare system. They said, hey, 10% payroll tax, single payer healthcare, you know, there you go. That's what you have the option to vote for. It got like 20% of the vote, right? Like people don't seem, at least on the state level, people don't seem to want policies like that necessarily. Now, I agree with you on certain things. Like paid family leave seems like an obvious, just like, why wouldn't you do it? Make it simple. You know,
sure,
maybe
I mean,
some free school meals and stuff. But I don't think states have as much room to do, you know, good welfare expansion, basically.
I agree that it's harder. I will just say also that U.S. states, although they are constrained by like federal taxation and stuff, insofar as you expect a public option to be sort of a replacement of like private fees, private payments with public taxation, presumably you're sort of replacing one thing for another. So I don't know that the fiscal space is that restricted. And I know that in other countries, like, Medicare in Canada started at a state level, a regional level. And I don't know. I agree that it's probably harder than when you have the whole government. It's just sort of frustrating that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think housing is probably the biggest thing that states could do to like greatly increase people's welfare. Having great expansions of non-market housing, and then having obviously ideally like a better regulatory state for building housing for private and public actors. Because it seems like if I was like the czar of California and I could just do whatever I wanted, it's like, dude, I think within a decade housing would be affordable in California. Like their policies seem to be so bad when it comes to housing affordability. And that's, I guess, to be fair, that's in part the reason I say this, because it's those are like sort of non-fiscal measures. Obviously, you could, turn the faucet on for investing in public housing, but that's just regulatory changes that could greatly, increase people's welfare, right? But, yeah, that's my thought.
Econoboi, you live in a potential swing state.
Yeah.
So the position that I offered to LonerBox earlier is that I, who lives in a glorious blue state, which has none of these really cool policies, except maybe, paid family leave? I say that I would be a proud Jill Stein voter, if only someone in a purple state wanted to trade votes with me, and they would vote for the Democrat. Is this a position that you get behind?
If I vote,
trading stand?
If I vote, I'll agree to vote. I'll vote for
I know
Kamala
you're voting
like you
Deb.
will.
I don't care about you. You're not a vote trade. Okay, I need a green voter.
Well, I mean,
Ridiculous.
to be fair, there is a pretty close Senate race in Maryland, so obviously you should vote for the Democrat in that race at the very least. But yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of lukewarm on like people voting for the Green Party in solid blue states. It's like, I guess it doesn't really matter if you do. But obviously your down ballot is still really important. Because a lot of people who say like, oh, I'm gonna vote for the Green Party because I live in New York. It's like, well, yeah, but be sure you're voting for Democrats for like House and
I think most
Congress
do.
at the very least.
Like we don't have super strong evidence on it, but I think most people who vote for the top of ticket green are probably going to vote down ballot blue.
Maybe. I'm not really sure. I mean, I know that. I guess I'm not sure if that's the case. A lot of times they don't have green options to vote for, so I wonder if they just leave their ballot blank, or if they, maybe because like what I'll do is if I don't have an option for a Democrat and there's a Libertarian, I'll just vote for the Libertarian. But if it's just a Republican, then obviously if it's just like an unimposed election, I'll vote for nobody, I guess. But anyway, but yeah, obviously not a big deal if you live in a solid blue state. But if you live in a swing state, it's like you should obviously vote for fucking the Democrats, ideally. But I mean, I think that the Green Party does. I get your argument on the spoiler effect and how a lot of these people would probably just not vote in the first place. But not voting is still bad. It's like, look, if you live in Michigan, you need to go out and fucking vote for the Democrat, right? It's not like, oh, it's not a big deal if you don't vote. It's like, no, dickhead, you need to vote, and you need to vote for the Democrat. Like the moral obligation, it sort of exists in both scenarios.
I will just say that like one of the reasons that I put out that article, like most socialists are going to vote for Harris, is that when you break down like the net margin among different ideologies, for socialists, it's like 91% are voting Harris, and then most of the other 9% are voting Stein or some random left party, but almost none are voting Trump. But then you go to liberals, and it's like 95% are voting Harris, but then like 3% are voting Trump. So the net margin is the same. And you go to progressives, and it's like the same deal.
Yeah.
And so, like, I guess the only thing I would say is that
I don't think it's necessarily socialists, right? But it's like certain, like, if like people, and I haven't seen the polling on this, but like people have said, like, oh, there's going to be like some like huge number of Muslim voters in Michigan that are going to like.
I think a lot of Muslim voters are not going to swallow like the amount of debt that happened in Israel. I just bluntly, I
mean, sure, but like, I'm just saying
Did you just say
that's
Israel?
dumb though. Like if you're
in occupied territories.
Oh, dog whistle.
I meant to say Israel's war.
Wow.
Oh my
Good
god.
call out, LB.
Why the fuck is healthcare costs and prescription drug costs? Why is that only 5% of people see that as the top issue in the United States? What the? I feel like in the United Kingdom is like top 3.
I was trying to look up
not
KFF
smart
polls, and the KFF said that consistently healthcare is like close to inflation. When you ask about people as when you ask it as an affordability issue, like affording healthcare is right up there with affording rent and affording like consumer goods.
But in terms of total number of issues, right?
I think sometimes it's.
Hang on,
I
I'll
think
show you the
sometimes
thing. Maybe I
because
got this wrong.
the way that people issue polls, sometimes it's like of all these issues, pick which ones are really important, and so you'll get sort of like a percentage who say this issue is important. But sometimes they'll ask literally what is like the number one issue,
Yeah.
and a lot of people in those polls will have like very much more disparate outcomes. Because I mean, I guess if you're always going to be short-term thinking, at least the average voter is going to be much more short-term thinking. And so even though healthcare is obviously a bigger long-term problem, they're going to say things like, oh, the economy, democracy, immigration, because those are just very immediate problems that people are kind of thinking about. And so, again, all the more reason why Democrats could have maybe a more radical healthcare plan that they at least pass. Because it's like, if it's not even top of mind for people, fucking just go for it.
Yeah, but it's weird. In the
Shoot
UK,
your
when
shot.
people are asked about their top issues, it's like by far economy, health, and immigration are top, and then everything else is like 20 points behind. But for here, it's like economy is taking the cake, and then you got what threats to democracy, yeah, and then what immigration, border security, abortion, Medicare, healthcare. I guess if you add Medicare and healthcare costs, you're at like 12%, so it's maybe around top 3, yeah, top 4.
Well, look, the other thing is that America has a 25% higher Hitlerite particle production rate. So the immigration border security is pushing down healthcare.
Yeah, right. And these 22% who say threats to democracy, like we don't know which proportion of them actually think that's a good thing, that there's a threat to democracy. So careful.
I am the 1% of Harris voters that think the 2020 election was rigged and it was good. That's right, brother.
Yeah. No, I'm the 1% of Harris voters that thinks Harris is a threat to democracy, and that's good.
True.
Queen Kamala taking over. No, I think I don't know. I'm real curious what the margins are going to be on this, because I have a feeling that honestly, Muslim voters are probably just going to vote like they normally did. Like I think like 2/3 of them are going to vote for Democrats, and maybe there's some like turnout differences, but I wonder how different that'll be in aggregate. Like I wouldn't be surprised if this is just like a lower turnout election than in 2020. And so, you know, I don't know.
How did they vote?
I'm really curious.
How did they vote during the Iraq War? Did they vote for the likes of Kerry, or I guess they wouldn't? Would they be? You basically expect them to, because Kerry was more opposed to the narrative about WMDs and shit.
I don't know
maybe
the
Gallup. Yeah, I was gonna say I think maybe Gallup or Pew has some good stuff on that, but I think the exit poll on Muslim voters I think it's been pretty steady over time. Like it's like 65% of them will vote for Democrats, but maybe that's changed over time. I'm not sure.
Yes, that'd be a loss of around 30 points among Muslim voters because of the war in Gaza.
30 points? What?
Well,
you think
like
95% of Muslims vote for Democrats?
Well, no, I'm saying the shift is that Stein seems to be getting like 30% of the vote in some of the like polls of Muslim voters. So I'm saying that the margin for Harris is probably like, I don't know, 30 points down.
That's crazy. I'm sorry. You know, if you're a Muslim voter out there, you know, half of my family's Muslim, obviously, my wife's side, but, you know, you got to vote for fucking Kamala, dude. Obviously, she's way better than Trump, but I've noticed that at least when it comes to Muslim, in my experience at least, and in some of the polling that I've seen, there's a serious gender divide, much like almost every group, where it seems like women Muslim voters are much more likely to vote for Kamala, but male Muslim voters are more likely to basically vote for not Kamala, right? It's like they're more likely to vote for like maybe Trump or Jill Stein or someone like that. And I guess that's really weird. I don't know why that is.
I mean, in the UK, George Galloway managed to win the Muslim vote in a by-election, but he lost it in the general right like immediately afterwards. And he did very much push for the Gaza vote. Like that was his entire platform for Muslim voters. But it lasted like a few months. So maybe they're more likely to protest poll than protest vote. I don't know.
I mean, I saw that. Like there was, what would there, like 4 or 5 different MPs who won basically.
Oh, we did have that,
entirely,
yeah. The independence, the Gaza independence, yeah.
Yeah, basically entirely on like Muslims vote for me, and they end up getting like 35% of the vote.
But that's also because we have much lower turnouts than I think you guys are expecting. People are just not as invested in politics right now here as they are in America.
That's true, and I guess it was only marginal. Like I wouldn't be surprised if the polling changed for Muslim voters, obviously, but I would be surprised if. I'd also be very angry if that's what made the difference between winning and losing.
You'd be very angry with the Muslims, would you?
The problem to me is that again, it's sort of like saying that Stein lost XYZ election. It could be mechanically true that like Green voters lose the election. It's just also mechanically true that a dozen other things lost it, right? Like moderates being willing to vote for like basically a fascist. That's all I'd say. When you look at the voting of like people by ideology, the people you should be mad at are liberals voting Trump and moderates voting Trump overwhelmingly.
Like on the margin, there's obviously a ton of reasons in a close election why someone wins or loses. Obviously, that's why, at least like my interpersonal criticism. I've talked to Muslim people. Obviously, I know a lot of Muslim people who are like very skeptical of voting for Kamala, and my conversations with them are always like, yeah, but like you realize that there's only two options. You can't not fucking vote for Kamala, okay? Like she's way better than Trump in like every conceivable way.
Well, so,
but you know, what do you?
I mean, I agree. Like, I think voting is a tool, and I think that most Green voters think that it's not. Like Stein said as much the other day. She said that it doesn't matter whether you come third, fourth, fifth, or sixth. All that matters is that you are an alternative to the corporate system. Like that's almost a verbatim quote.
But that's why I get so angry though at people who vote for Jill Stein. It's like,
well, so the reason it's
one
frustrating to me
thing
is that most people on the left should have the political awareness to know that it's a bad vote. Like that's what's frustrating. At the same time, I think blaming that for like the loss is a bad idea. It's overwhelmingly
there is something a bit
point.
frustrating to think that like even just the potential of losing a vote, because I don't know if it's like, is it like a more radicalized like Muslim youth in America, like the ones who were born in the United States and they got like that radical left kind of overlapping with the kind of like Arab sensibilities or Middle Eastern sensibilities about Israel, or is it like boomers who are just watching Al Jazeera all day where it just says genocide in Gaza along the bottom for the entire fucking broadcast, or like what's that is kind of frustrating, isn't it? Like, I don't know, yeah, if that's what's happening.
I'm not sure.
I mean, it's not like they're the only ones, right? Like, yeah, like you said, I feel the same way about people who call themselves centrists who are going to vote for Trump, right? And you're Piers Morgans and you're fucking, as if there's any kind of parity between Kamala and Trump. Like,
well, I was just going to say, it's not even about,
go ahead.
I was going to say, it's not about the strategic argument either. I would say, again, the reason I get so angry in part is because it would be one thing if Jill Stein was like not a complete dumbass and like actually a good candidate and actually knew what the fuck she was talking about. It's like, hey, at least I could look at those people and be like, yeah, like at least you're voting for someone who's like got a good idea of what it would conceivably be like to be president, as unlikely as it is. Jill Stein doesn't seem to know shit about like anything she talks about. Like she's clearly dumb as hell. And she also, what do you call it? You know, there was that recent appearance she made on, I can't remember the podcast or whatever she was on.
Breakfast Club,
where
right?
that lady, the lady asks her how many people are in the house. She doesn't know how many people are in the house. She didn't know the answer. Like, this is fucking government.
Yeah, but she's not bought and paid for by
shit.
the military-industrial machine and the genocide machine and the military and the machine. Did you forget?
I mean, the government, you know, the same government machine paid for hopefully a public education where she could have learned, you know, basic facts about the fucking government. But apparently, dumbass Jill Stein doesn't know. And it's like you're clearly voting for someone who is between the rock of being incredibly stupid and the hard place of being a grifter. Right? It's like she either doesn't know this information because she does not give a fundamental fuck about it because she's just a grifter, or she's just incredibly stupid. Like every one of her foreign policy ideas, basically besides, just end the genocide, which Jill Stein doesn't, just imagine, like if Jill Stein was president, if Jill Stein was president, there's like literally a 0% chance that Israel would become any less radical than they currently are.
That's how you get around. That's how you get around Dola Specialis. You know, like the kind of special intent that can be undone with one phone call. This guy she's running with is absolutely an anti-Semite as well. I'll say that. Just throw that out there. The Green Party Zionist entity. Yeah, fuck it.
The biggest like foundational criticism I have of the Green Party is not the spoiler candidate stuff. It's that they run tinfoil hat, fucking crazy anti-vax, like weird leftist, like hippie type motherfuckers who are just stupid.
Well, the reason they
don't know what they're talking about.
They don't. So it's cyclical. They don't win anything, and then they run the worst candidates ever. So like this is something that I've talked about this with like left groups with you a little bit. Why is it that left-wing groups splinter so much? Well, part of the reason is that tiny left groups composed of Trotskyists, composed of like Maoists or whatever, are people who want to be hyper pure in their ideology, but are also in a group that has no power. Without power, there's nothing to cohere. So like if you look up the primaries for the 2020 or 2024 Green presidential system, there were like two candidates running against Stein this time. Like there's nobody who cares because it's a tiny party. It has no money and no chance of winning. So why would you join if you're serious?
That's a great point though, but it just goes back to that foundational sort of interpersonal criticism where it's like, you say Harris is so bad, so you're going to vote for Stein. But if you had the fucking, most basic idea of who Jill Stein is, you'd realize she's a complete dumbass.
So, the point that I gave earlier to LonerBox is that voting is not an endorsement, it's a tool. So I'm not voting for Kamala because I endorse everything she believes in. And I'm not vote trading to vote for Stein. DM me anyone if you want to trade. I'm not voting for Stein because I endorse everything she believes in. I'd be voting because I want to either like protest and signal that Dems should move left, or I'm voting. That's honestly what I think. Like the only way you should think of it as rationally is a tool. You're trying to signal that Dems, that there's a voter base to your left, and if you just move left, we will vote for you. It's sort of. Are you familiar with the Working Families Party in New York?
AOC's
Yeah, I am.
people, yeah.
So it works differently there because they have something called fusion balloting. So you can have one candidate on multiple parties. But what Working Families Party tries to do is say, hey, you know, there's like 5% of the voters, 10% of voters in New York City, New York State that want left-wing politics, and we will endorse you if you just put those forward. Now, the Working Families Party is like 2 steps right of where I am, but it's sort of the same logic.
No, I understand, but I think you've also, obviously, we're talking to the preeminent scholar on leftist movements, SDL. But like, I think we've talked about this before about how if you actually look at the platform, and this is a practical criticism, obviously, which would require an in-depth conversation with a voter like this. But like, if you look at, you know, who's had more of an impact on moving the country's sort of political lexicon to the left, it's obviously not Jill Stein or the Green Party, right? It's obviously people like AOC and Bernie that work within democratic frameworks to move the left party to the left, right?
After this, I can send you. I forget who wrote it, but there's this clip from a book written, I think 2007 or something, which argues that Dems should run in primaries, and that if only Nader had run in a primary, you would have seen like a bunch of movements outside the Democratic Party form, a bunch of organizations that would be around like left-wing politics. You'd see a bunch of people elected in state legislatures, which is pretty much what happened after Bernie Sanders actually ran in 2016. Like, people have been arguing exactly this position long before it happened, and they were right. And like, I broadly agree. I think that the only way that you're going to have meaningful exercise of access to like state legislative power or federal power is democratic primaries. And even more importantly, a lot of people will say that you need to be a credible threat to Democrats, either that you won't vote for them or that you can make them lose in order for them to make them shift left. Okay, well, what's a credible threat to them? The Green Party that always loses? No, it's like the primary threat that it can actually win, right? Like, you're
yeah,
way more...
I mean, like, look at wave after wave of conservatives moving far. You know, the conservative shift to the right started basically in the mid '90s, right? And how did that happen? It didn't happen because the Libertarian Party got 5% of the vote in a national presidential election. It was because wave after wave after wave after wave for like 2 decades straight, leading all the way up to today with MAGA Republicans got primaried out of office. And so everyone else in the party had to shift further and further and further to the right, obviously to the country's detriment, because right-wing politics is much worse than left-wing politics, of course. But that's how, I mean, I don't know how people don't look at that and just be like, oh yeah, it's like obviously the way to shift a party's political opinion. It's not to just run against them in a first-past-the-post system. It's to work within their frameworks and try to primary people that you don't like out of office. There's many Democrats I would say need to be primaried out of office, right? But I'd never say vote for fucking the Green Party to shift the party to the left. It just, you know, it never works, obviously. So it's
no, I mean, that's the argument, right? That primaries work and outside doesn't.
That's true.
The only thing that I would give is that, like, in the presidential, so the reason that the presidential race or safe races in general could be different is that the logic that you should vote for the leftmost viable candidate only holds in competitive elections. So if you're in a blue state, you're not in a competitive election, right? And if you're in, say, like a 70% Dem district, you're also not in a competitive election. I can see the logic there for wanting to vote for a candidate which signals that there is a constituency to the right or to the left. Now, it would be even better if you did that during the primary, where there's a reasonable chance that you could actually win. But I can understand at least that it's the same intuition of trying to show that there is a constituency. Please move in this direction.
Yeah, I guess so. I judge the protest vote for Jill Stein because it's like, I'm sure that there's good members of the left who are running as protest candidates. I mean, I guess I'm imagining this to be the case. I'm not actually sure if it's the case.
Maybe Cornel West. I don't know. If you look into PSL, they're like a Marxist-Leninist party, and if you look into them even further, they have like a bunch of very credible abuse allegations, and they are completely undemocratic. They have many of the same leaders they've had for 20 years. Like, it's
Who's
not
the socialist lady running under the U.S. What was it? It's like the Socialist Party of America or something.
That's what I'm saying. That's you're thinking.
Oh, that's the PSL. Okay.
Yeah, like they're a really bad org.
Right in Bernie or something. Like, I don't know. It's just like, why are you boosting this clear fucking propagandist grifter, Jill Stein? You know, it's like, be more thoughtful with your fucking protest vote if you're going to protest vote, right? That's kind of my point.
Well, the problem. Okay, let me put it like this. It's not okay. The Democratic Party does not care how thoughtful your vote is. They just care that there is a constituency like left or right. Should I go and move to get that? Right. Like
but
the
your
way you
protest
just
vote
give an example of
has
this did happen after Perot. Perot ran in the center, and he ran on cutting the debt. He ran on anti-immigration stuff. He ran on cutting like social spending. He ran on lower taxes, and both parties shifted towards that as a result. So like when you are a credible threat, parties do respond, not as much as you'd like. There is a response there. So it's not irrational to do protest votes. It's just irrational to do a protest vote when you have a chance of actually winning power outright. Like the value of a protest vote is like 1,000 times less than just winning power.
Yeah, but you are marginally boosting the brand of the person who you're protest voting for. Like for instance, in 2020, the Green Party candidate was Howie Hawkins. My understanding of Howie Hawkins is he was literally one of the founders of the Green Party back in like the 1970s or something. I don't really know how
he and
awful
Noam Chomsky actually.
Yeah, like I don't really know how awful or how much of a grifter Howie Hawkins is, but like
the municipalism guy. Sorry, whatever his name is. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm not sure, but I don't know how much of a grifter, how awful Howie Hawkins is, but like he doesn't seem as bad as Jill Stein. Basically, I don't necessarily judge people as hard. He only got a few 100,000 votes, and obviously Biden won that election, right? So there's basically no argument that he did.
Howie Hawkins is very much a like hardline socialist in like the sense that he just doesn't want to run Dems. He gets really mad at other parties saying you should work with Democrats. Like he's gotten super mad at socialist parties being like we critically endorse Bernie Sanders. So he's just like an anti-Dem socialist, whereas Stein is a campist and also like a medical misinformation promoter. So that's why she has so many weird brainworms. Howie, I'm sure he has like his own bad views. I know. Chat. If you want one sign of like how Hawkins being different, he was very pro-Ukraine. Like it's just meaningful difference.
Yeah. I mean, he seems at least again, it just who you're boosting, right? Like I wouldn't be surprised. Jill Stein ends her presidential campaign, makes no difference, starts some grifty podcast, and swells up to a decent Patreon audience, and that's like all she does until she dies, basically, right? It's like, oh, this sucks. She's just a grifter trying to make money, basically, from running for president. It's like, oh, no, absolutely. What can I do in 2024? Could I do anything that makes any substantial difference, or could I get a fucking Russian-funded paid vacation for 9 months while I run for president and go on podcasts? It's like that's kind of what it feels like. With Jill Stein,
people said she was getting all over people's social media feeds right after Trump lost the debate. That's not actually true, though. It was after the Tim Pool leaks that everyone who was covering that from the kind of like alt populist left bullshit place, like Brianna Joy Gray and George Galloway and Glenn Greenwald, they all, for some reason, decided to shoehorn in promotions of Jill Stein during their coverage of that. I wonder if this has just been like like when this marching order was given. I don't know.
I'm not sure. At least in the UK, the Green Party can win a couple of seats. Like you don't even have.
Yeah, but our Green Party, like they run in local elections, they build power, they coalition build. Like they work at a local level. Yeah, they do all this kind of shit. They don't just appear like fucking Mary Poppins once every 4 years to say I'm back. Like
I will say, so I wrote an article recently called "The Green Party Always Loses," which outlines some of this. The Green Party does run a lot of local elections. In fact, that's the only place where they ever win. Like they haven't won a state legislature election since 2006. And I know the fun fact that I always like to bring up is that the guy who won in 2006 is now a MAGA Republican. But they win about 20% of their elections in local races to like town, like city councils and stuff, like mayorships. It's just that they've a really low rate of winning. It's only 20%, and they only run like 100 people a year. So they only have like 50 electeds, like mayors and city councilors across the whole US, which is about 0.02% of local elections. So like they could be doing more. They probably should be doing more. One of the things that's especially frustrating is Stein has all this attention on her because Clinton was sort of a bad candidate, so she got a lot of attention. Biden was like not a great candidate, so Hawkins got some attention. They did way better than the Green Party did for like the previous years. And what have they converted to? Well, they haven't even run in more local elections. There's fewer and fewer Green Parties candidates running each year. Like the party increasingly is literally just the presidential campaign. So it's
right. I mean, it's like I was talking to Larry Sharp a few years ago or something, and I asked him a similar question. I was like, why do you guys run for governor and president? Like, it seems like to me, like if I was you guys, I would do both simultaneously. It's like, why don't you guys focus a lot of your central resources on like maybe one city and just try to elect a few people to the city council, a few people to school boards, a few people to utility districts. Just try to build out some local power base. And then guess what? If you're like the city councilor, if you choose Cleveland, Ohio or something as your example, and you have like 2 libertarian city council members who are sort of your A-list candidates or whatever, yeah, just make those people your presidential nominees or something, right? Like, who cares? Who the fuck are the people running for presidential, on the presidential ticket for the Libertarian Party anyway? Like, bunch of nobodies, right? So at least this guy's a city councilman from fucking Cleveland or something. And you can do both simultaneously. His response was like, well, you run for the biggest office you think you can win. But it's like, Larry, nobody with a fucking brain in their head who runs as the Libertarian candidate for New York is going to think they can win. You can't honestly say you think you can become the governor of New York. There's no way that that's true, Larry, right? And same thing with Jill Stein. It's like, Jill, you know for a fact you can't win this race. I guess she says you shouldn't care about winning, which is more honest maybe. But still, it's like, what the
No, so that I will say the only defense that I've actually seen of the presidential campaign is that in some states, running as a presidential campaign is like cheaper and an easier way to get ballot access to all the races below than it is by getting, like, say, 30,000 signatures. But I don't know. I'm honestly of the opinion that, like, if the only way that you're getting ballot access is by, like, running a presidential campaign that is doomed for a bunch of local races that have no power and that you lose 80% of, like, is that worth it either? I mean, I'm not a fan of, like, I would prefer a world where the Greens exclusively ran in, like, blue states with the goal of trying to pressure Dems to the left. Like, I do think that could work. You want to target non-competitive races. That's the only place where the game theory makes sense. Like, the game theory does not make sense that you would want to risk even possibly any election in any of the swing states. So I mean, when you look at when you ask Green voters why they're voting, they do not give you, like, power maximizing answers. They do not give you game theoretic answers. They give you answers saying, I will never vote for the Democratic Party. And to be clear, most of the people who are saying it, this is in response to the question you asked way earlier, LonerBox, like, people who are voting for the Green Party were often saying this, like, years and years earlier. Brown Joy Gray voted Green in 2016 and 2020, and she said she would never vote for Biden way before any of this stuff, like, way before October 7th. This is a person who has a very strong opposition to the Democratic Party, not based on one policy, but based on, like, a huge number of them.
I think that
whatever.
I think the difference is if you're going to run on this sort of, like, pull the Democrats left idea, the problem is like you have to have your positions in a way that they can be compromised with, like with Bernie, right? Whereas with the Greens, it's like they'll just set up this kind of, like, maximalist standard where, like, you have to be with us 100% or you're a genocider, So that's kind of a bit of, it's almost like they're trying to push you away. Yeah.
No, this is what I was saying. Like, I mentioned Econoboi earlier in this chat that there was a plan with someone named Nora Elcott, if I didn't mess up her name. I think
Nora Ericott.
Ericott, yeah. Nora Ericott to run as the VP for the Green Party. And then if the Democrats conceded, basically, so to speak, on some pro-Palestine issues, like actually achieving a ceasefire, and she would have demanded an arms embargo. I don't know what she would have qualified as that. But if the Dems achieve those demands, then they actually would have dropped out. I think that's actually a very compelling thing. You want to pick, like, one issue for the Democrats to concede on, and then you won't run in the election. That's only worthwhile in competitive elections, though, is the only thing I would say, LonerBox. Like, your strategy in a competitive election, if the only thing you care about is moving someone left, would be to run a competitive concessionary campaign where you are going to try as hard as possible to get as many votes as possible, but you'll pull back and you'll tell everyone to vote the other way the minute they concede. But in a uncompetitive campaign, you're no threat to them, right? You're no threat if you offer to concede. So you just want to run as big as possible just to show that there's a reason to shift left. Because in an uncompetitive election, they have no incentive to care really about anything, right? It's like, that's a more broad problem with the US, that we just have so many uncompetitive districts. But given that, it's like, what should you do as a power maximizing or ideology maximizing view?
I think
the short
the
answer that I gave earlier, just to be clear, Green Party power maximizing in, like, uncompetitive elections is extremely ineffective. Just run in the primaries. This is what I've argued over and over and over again. It actually works. Like, when DSA runs, it wins about half of the primaries that it runs in. For federal office, it wins about 15%, which sounds bad, and it is bad, but it's really hard to win federal office. Like, the win rate for federal office is, I think, like 5% or something for all candidates.
I mean, look at, like, a candidate like Rashida Tlaib. I mean, she's got to be the most vocally critical of the Democratic Party. I don't even know if she's committed to endorsing Harris at this point. I don't think she has. But it's like she's such an agitating force within the Democratic Party. But she's like within the Democratic Party, though, right? She's able to win an election, be a member of Congress, and obviously have a substantially more regular platform for her advocacy than running as a fucking Green candidate or some shit, right? By the way, you know who else used to be a Green Party candidate? Kristen Sinema, one of the worst people in the Senate.
It is funny.
All right? Another example of the Green Party taking an L.
I know that something's like sometimes people argue that if you have to run outside the Democratic Party or else you're going to get co-opted rightward. And the reason I mentioned the fact like the MAGA Republican guy is that was the only case, like the single example where the Greens ever won a state legislative election, honestly. Like it was a tried and true Green candidate, not a Democrat who was just hiding their power level. That was the single election they won. And then a decade later, he is a like hard right Christian conservative.
He's a MAGA Republican, right? The guy who won in 2006.
Yeah, no, he's a MAGA Republican. He has stuff on his page anyway. And then Cynthia McKinney, right, their 2008 candidate. She's Jew posting all the time on Twitter. She's like talking about how Jews run America. She's promoting David Duke. Like,
it's actually crazy the extent to which
never would have happened to a liberal, hey?
Well, I mean, like, Bernie does take an L. He does take an L for platforming Brianna Joy Gray. That's another example. It's like,
true,
dude, you wanted this lady. This lady could have been the White House like press secretary. Holy shit! Like that's crazy to think, and it does make me wonder. It really does make me wonder. Like, man, I wonder how crazy some of these fucking people really are. You know, like who are actually in government.
You know how I was saying earlier that the lack of power causes decoherence? I do think something that you saw is that a lot of people who weren't interested in power and were just interested either in grifting or in purity, they split off after Bernie endorsed Clinton, right? They refused to get back on board in 2020. And I do think there's an argument that like the left, quote unquote, had a really weak bench, which is why you got a lot of people like BJG, because there just weren't many people to pull from. My hope would be that future progressive candidates now have a much bigger bench. Like the Congressional Progressive Caucus is like twice as big as it was, I think, in like 2010. Bernie actually founded the Congressional Progressive Caucus, right? Didn't even exist 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So my hope is that like there is a bench building operation that like will hopefully produce a lower rate of crazy people.
I mean, maybe. I think what I worry though is that I feel like it'll be like what is probably true about the Democrats. Like one criticism the Republicans have is, yeah, but they demonize Trump, but they'll demonize any of our candidates. Look at what they said about Mitt Romney. And it's like that's kind of true. Like that's kind of the nature of politics, right? Is that you're never going to ultimately. It's just like we're not going to become a one-party state. Like you're never going to ultimately concede in a competitive democratic framework, right? And so it's like if fucking Rashida Tlaib was the Democratic nominee in like 2032 or some shit, the Green Party would just come up with probably some crazy reasons to say how awful she is, right? Maybe they'll make a more systemic critique. Oh, even though Rashida's the candidate, it's like the whole system's corrupt and we need to have this transformational, fundamentally different power structure. It's like, fuck, dude.
What's funny is that not even all socialist organizations. So let me give you an example. Socialist Alternative ran Kashama Sawant, and they were very much like a refuse to run in democratic elections party. In fairness, running Kashama Sawant was fairly intelligent because it was nonpartisan race. So like it's where you'd expect it to work, and it did. But they also endorsed a soft strategy of supporting Bernie Sanders in the primary. Now, their strategy was that if they support him in the primary, they might be able to get him to run as an independent in the general, which was stupid. But even the idea of being willing to support Democrats in the primary is something that some socialist organizations are on board with. I know an odd one that I like to point to is Communist Party USA nowadays is like well to the right of DSA. They just endorse whatever Democrat comes up. They won't say they endorse it. They'll just say like how much they hate the other guy, and then they'll have like one sentence about how bad Biden is or one sentence about how bad Harris is. And I don't know, like I think even like Freedom Road Socialist Organization, which is like a post-Maoist organization, they even de facto endorsing voting for the lesser evil. So like it just is funny that like I think that part of what you're seeing is there's a big market in being loudly anti-Dem, but it's not uniform even among pretty hardcore socialists. That's all. Like it's even among organizations, it's sort of striking.
Yeah, of course. I mean, obviously, most, like you said, like 90%, overwhelming portion of socialists are going to vote for Democrats, right? It's just on the margin; these things get highly scrutinized. Obviously, like a lot of the uncommitted voters in Michigan, right? They're not voting for Harris because they're socialist, right? It's because they're Muslim and have this sort of disproportionate issue weighting of Gaza, right? And so I don't know. It's like there's a lot of. I mean, and then there's, like you said, there's all these MAGA people that are voting for Trump because they're just like, brain broken or something. Like, what do you say about those people, right? Like, holy shit. They've just lost it, I guess. There's no saving them. All right, guys.
Well, there you go, LonerBox. That's the argument for voting for Jill Stein, okay? If you're in a blue state, you have to vote for Jill Stein, after trading votes
This is like
with
the
a
most
green voter
idiosyncratic,
in a
least
blue state.
convicted Jill Stein voter. Okay, I enjoyed the conversation. It was good.
No, I'm the most hardcore Jill Stein voter, if you're willing to trade your vote with me and you live in a purple state.
All right.
Couldn't you just somebody just tell SDL they live in a purple state and that they'll, trade their just say.
There's surely a
I'm gonna
forum
look-
that you can do that in, right? Like Craigslist
Well,
or
so
the fuck you guys use.
what's frustrating
Just
is
lie to
that
SDL.
there actually were vote trading attempts set up in 2016. They were just very small and didn't get a lot of coverage. This was actually a huge thing. I mentioned it earlier in the 2000 election. And it might have gotten Gore a victory, like for how successful it was, except that it was taken to court. I think Republicans sued and took it to court. And it was ultimately found constitutional, but like the uncertainty about it destroyed the effort of it for like decades.
Yeah, dude. If Gore won, we would maybe have socialism in this country.
God damn.
Unbelievable. Goodness. All right, it was good talking,
So all I'm
guys.
just saying, voter trading is the only path to putting Al Gore in the presidency. So you better support it, chat.
That's true. Write in Al Gore if you're going to protest vote. See you guys.
Oh, did you have anything else to say?
If you live in a purple state and you're actually a Stein voter, trade votes with me. I don't know.
Yeah, good luck with it. Tell me how it goes.
Thanks, LonerBox.
All right.
Wait, I do want to complain. Your chat, there's like 5 people in chat that are convinced I'm like a hardcore Green voter, and I'm so mad about this. I've written like the most comprehensive takedowns of the Green Party ever. That's why I want them not to vote Green in purple states.
Listen, it's just a minority, all right? We get a lot of there's a lot of Jewish people in this chat, okay, and they really hate. They're really angry with lefties right now, Israelis and such. But it's all right. They're also just retarded. It's one of those.
All right, well, thank you. I'll take that as a concession. I agree, chat. Definitely well regarded. Have a nice evening.
All right, bye. That wasn't really the kind of Jill Stein defense I was expecting, but it's something.